Before starting the video, I request to like the video and leave a sweet comment. Hello everyone. Welcome back to the Dark Index. Tonight, we return with another scary collection of stories that have been hidden on purpose beneath layers of silence and lies. In this episode, we will look deeply into the dark corners of small-town America with 8 terrifying tales of secret groups working right in front of everyone, controlling whole towns through fear, tricks, and terrible acts. These groups may look like harmless community clubs, history groups, or charity organizations, but behind their respectable appearances lies a darkness that has taken many innocent lives. Each story you are about to hear has been carefully researched and put together from people who saw what happened, leaked papers, and survivors who risked everything to tell the truth. The names of places and people have been carefully changed to protect those who bravely came forward, as many of these secret groups continue to work without being caught to this day. From the rolling hills of Vermont to the plains of Kansas, these hidden groups have woven themselves so deeply into their towns that questioning them has proven deadly for many who tried to find out the truth. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe for daily true horror content that shows the disturbing secrets hidden in our own backyards. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover the secrets that they never wanted you to know about. Angela Morrison never expected to get anything from her great-aunt Ruth, a woman she had met only once at a family reunion when she was 12 years old. Ruth had been unmarried and lived alone in rural Montana, sending Christmas cards with $5 bills inside, but otherwise keeping no contact with the family. So when a lawyer from Riverside, Montana, called to tell Angela that she had inherited a house, 20 acres of land, and a small savings account, it felt like winning a surprise prize. The drive from Denver to Riverside took Angela through some of the most beautiful land she had ever seen. Rolling grasslands stretched as far as the eye could see, broken by groups of cottonwood trees and the occasional ranch house sitting alone under the huge Montana sky. Riverside itself was exactly what she had expected from a small town with a population of 1,423 people. Main Street had a few blocks of brick buildings from the early 1900s, a grain tower that stood above everything else, and the kind of wide streets that had been made for horse-drawn wagons. Great-aunt Ruth's house sat on the edge of town, a simple 2-story farmhouse surrounded by fields that had been rented to nearby ranchers for many years. The lawyer, a quiet man named Harold Perkins, met Angela at the property to give her the keys and explain the inheritance. Ruth had been 91 when she died peacefully in her sleep, he explained, and had lived in the same house for more than 60 years. She had been active in community work right up until the end, especially with a group called the Riverside Fellowship that ran the town's food bank and homeless shelter. Angela had taken time off from her job as a marketing worker in Denver to spend a month in Riverside, going through Ruth's belongings and deciding whether to sell the property or keep it as a weekend getaway. The house was filled with many years of collected items, from old furniture to boxes of photos showing Ruth's work in different community groups. Angela found herself interested in the glimpses into her great-aunt's life, especially her volunteer work with the Riverside Fellowship. The fellowship had been started in 1972 by Pastor David Brennan, a charming minister who had arrived in Riverside with a dream of creating a truly Christian community where neighbors helped one another and no one went hungry or homeless. Unlike regular churches that focused mainly on Sunday services, the fellowship worked 7 days a week, providing meals for older people, temporary housing for families in trouble, and job training programs for anyone who needed help getting back on their feet. Angela's First meeting with the fellowship came on her third day in town when Pastor Brennan knocked on her door with a casserole and a warm welcome to the community. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair, kind eyes, and the sort of gentle way that immediately made people feel comfortable. He had known Ruth for many years. He explained and wanted to say he was sorry for her loss, while also letting Angela know that the fellowship was there to help if she needed anything. During her stay in Riverside, Pastor Brennan invited Angela to attend the fellowship's weekly community dinner held every Wednesday evening in the basement of what had once been the Methodist Church. The building had been bought by the fellowship years earlier when the Methodist group shrank to just a few elderly members. Angela accepted the invitation, curious to learn more about the group that had been such an important part of her great-aunt's life. The community dinner was exactly what Angela had expected from a small-town charity event. About 60 people gathered around long tables, sharing a simple but filling meal of pot roast, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The crowd was a mix of elderly residents, young families, and a few people who looked like they might be staying at the fellowship's homeless shelter. Pastor Brennan said grace before the meal, thanking God for bringing the community together and asking for continued blessings on their work, helping those in need. After dinner, Pastor Brennan gave a short talk about the fellowship's activities and encouraged everyone to volunteer however they could. The group ran on a very small budget, he explained, depending entirely on donations and volunteer work to keep their programs running. They were always looking for people to help serve meals, sort donations at the thrift store, or provide rides for elderly residents who needed help getting to doctor appointments. Angela volunteered to help with the thrift store, thinking it would give her something useful to do while she sorted through Ruth's belongings. The store was in a former auto parts shop on Main Street, its windows filled with donated furniture, clothing, and household items. The manager was a cheerful woman in her 50s named Carol Hendris, who'd been volunteering with the fellowship since its early days and seemed to know everyone in town. Working at the thrift store gave Angela a different view of Riverside's social life. The customers were a mix of bargain hunters and people who really needed affordable goods, but Carol had an amazing ability to tell the difference between the two groups. Regular customers who were struggling financially were quietly offered extra discounts or allowed to take items without payment, while tourists passing through town paid full price for the same items. It was during her second week volunteering that Angela began to notice some troubling patterns in the fellowship's work. Several times she saw Carol having whispered conversations with customers, arrangements that seemed to involve more than just buying used clothing or furniture. These conversations always happened near the back of the store, away from other customers, and always ended with the customer leaving through the back door rather than the front door. Angela's curiosity grew when she discovered that the thrift store's back room contained far more items than could fit in the main store. Boxes and bags of donated items were stacked to the ceiling, creating narrow paths between tall walls of goods. Carol explained that they were always behind on sorting donations, but something about her explanation didn't seem right. Why would a charity store hold back items when they needed money to fund their programs? The answer became clearer when Angela volunteered to help with the fellowship's weekly food delivery. Every Saturday morning, volunteers loaded trucks with groceries and delivered them to elderly residents and families who couldn't make it to the fellowship's main location. Angela was assigned to ride along with a driver named Tom Martinez, a quiet man in his 30s who seemed uncomfortable with small talk but knew exactly where to find every person on their route. The food delivery route took them to some of the poorest areas around Riverside. including a group of mobile homes near the railroad tracks and several isolated farmhouses where elderly residents lived alone. At each stop, Tom would carry boxes of groceries to the door while Angela waited in the truck. She noticed that the conversations at each door lasted much longer than needed for a simple food delivery, and people often handed Tom envelopes or small packages before he returned to the truck. When Angela asked Tom about the long conversations, he became evasive and changed the subject. The people on their route were grateful for the fellowship's help, he said, and sometimes liked to chat about their lives or share news about their families. It was an important part of the group's mission to provide not just material help, but also human connection to isolated members of the community. Angela might have accepted this explanation if not for what she found in Ruth's personal papers, hidden in a shoebox at the back of her great-aunt's closet was a collection of documents that painted a very different picture of the Riverside Fellowship's activities. Bank statements showed that Ruth had been making monthly payments to the Fellowship for years, far more than reasonable donations to a charity. More disturbing were handwritten notes in Ruth's careful writing documenting her concerns about the Fellowship's special services and her fear that she was being watched by other members of the group. One note dated just 3 months before Ruth's death was especially chilling. Ruth wrote that she had discovered the true purpose of the Fellowship's food delivery program and was planning to contact authorities outside of Riverside. She was convinced that Pastor Brennan and his inner circle were using the group's charity work as a cover for illegal activities, possibly involving the elderly residents who received regular visits from Fellowship volunteers. Ruth's final note expressed her terror that the Fellowship had discovered her suspicions. She wrote that her house was being watched, her phone calls were being monitored, and she was afraid to leave her property alone. She had hidden copies of evidence in different places around the house and hoped that someday someone would find them and expose the truth about the Riverside Fellowship's operations. Angela spent the next 2 days searching every inch of Ruth's house, following clues from her great-aunt's mysterious notes. In the basement, hidden behind a loose stone in the foundation wall, she found a manila envelope containing photographs, financial records, and a detailed journal documenting the Fellowship's criminal activities. The evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for many years, under the disguise of Christian charity. The Fellowship's food distribution program was actually a drug trafficking network that used elderly residents as unknowing middlemen. Volunteers would deliver groceries containing hidden packages of illegal drugs, then collect payment and redistribute the drugs through the thrift store and other Fellowship operations. Elderly people who became suspicious or threatened to report. The activities were systematically isolated and eventually killed through carefully given drug overdoses that looked like natural deaths. Ruth's journal documented at least 15 suspicious deaths among Fellowship food recipients over the past 10 years, all elderly people who had died alone in their homes after expressing concerns about the group's activities. The local sheriff, Rita Valdez, was either involved in the cover-up or incompetent, because none of these deaths had triggered serious investigations despite the obvious pattern. Even more horrifying was Ruth's discovery that the Fellowship was also involved in elder abuse and financial exploitation on a massive scale. The group systematically identified isolated elderly residents, gained their trust through charity services, then gradually took control over their finances and medical care. Victims were encouraged to name the Fellowship as beneficiaries in their wills, then died under suspicious circumstances that allowed the group to inherit their property and money. Angela realized that she was in immediate danger. If the Fellowship had killed Ruth to prevent her from exposing their activities, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate Ruth's heir, who had inherited the evidence. She packed the most damaging documents in her car and drove directly to the state capitol, where she presented the evidence to the Montana Attorney General's office and requested protection for herself and any other potential witnesses. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the Riverside Fellowship's criminal enterprise. Pastor David Brennan and 12 of his associates were arrested on charges ranging from drug trafficking to elder abuse to multiple counts of murder. The group had been responsible for the deaths of at least 23 people over 15 years, using their charity activities as a perfect cover for systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable members of their community. Sheriff Rita Valdez was also arrested, charged with corruption and blocking justice for her role in covering up the Fellowship's crimes. The investigation revealed that she had received regular payments from the group and had deliberately failed to investigate suspicious deaths among elderly residents. Angela Morrison never returned to Riverside after testifying at the trial. She sold her great-aunt's property and donated the money to real organizations that actually helped elderly residents. The house where Ruth had lived and died now stands, empty, its windows boarded up like a monument to the victims of a charity group that used compassion as a weapon against the people they pretended to serve. Marcus Whitfield had been covering small-town politics for the Burlington Herald for over 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would uncover in Millfield, Vermont. The assignment seemed routine enough when his editor handed it to him on a gray October morning. The town of 847 residents had been selected for a state heritage grant worth $2 million, and the paper wanted a feel-good story about rural communities preserving their historical character. What Marcus discovered instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. Millfield sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills covered in sugar maple trees, their leaves burning red and gold in the autumn light. Main Street looked like something from a painting, complete with a white church steeple, a general store, with wooden floors that creaked under your feet, and houses with wraparound porches where elderly residents waved from their rocking chairs. The Millfield Preservation Society had done an excellent job maintaining the town's 19th century charm, right down to the gas street lamps that cast warm pools of light along the sidewalks each evening. Eleanor Ashworth, the Society's president, met Marcus at the town's small historical museum on his first day. She was a woman in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun, and the kind of careful speech that suggested years of public speaking. Her handshake was firm, her smile welcoming, and her knowledge of local history was complete. She walked him through displays of Civil War artifacts, pioneer farming tools, and old photographs of long-dead residents whose descendants still lived in the same houses their great-great-grandparents had built. The Preservation Society had been founded in 1968, Eleanor explained, when developers from Boston had threatened to build a shopping complex on the edge of town. A group of concerned citizens had joined together to protect Millfield's character, eventually succeeding in having the entire downtown district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Since then, the society had grown to include nearly every business owner and prominent family in town. They controlled what could be built, what could be renovated, and what needed to be preserved exactly as it was. Marcus spent his first few days interviewing long-time residents and photographing the pristine Victorian houses that lined Elm Street. Everyone he spoke with praised the Preservation Society's work. The town had avoided the strip malls and chain restaurants that had invaded other rural communities. Property values had remained stable even during economic downturns. Young families were moving to Millfield specifically because it offered the kind of safe, traditional environment that seemed to be disappearing everywhere else in New England. But there were subtle things that began to bother Marcus as he continued his reporting. When he asked about families who had moved away from Millfield, conversations became awkward and vague. People would mention that so-and-so had decided to try their luck elsewhere or had found better opportunities in the city, but could never provide specific details about where these former residents had gone or what they were doing now. When Marcus asked for contact information so he could interview some of these families for a broader view of the town's development, he was told that most people had lost touch over the years. The town's public records also struck him as oddly incomplete. The clerk's office had careful documentation going back to the 1800s, but there were strange gaps in more recent decades. Death certificates, property transfers, and even high school graduation records seemed to be missing for certain years, particularly the late 1980s and mid-1990s. When Marcus asked about these gaps, he was told that there had been a fire in the basement storage area and some documents had been damaged beyond recovery. Deputy Jim Kowski was the only person Marcus met who seemed truly uncomfortable discussing the Preservation Society. Jim was a big man in his 40s who had grown up in Millfield, left for college and time in the army, then returned home to join the small police force. When Marcus interviewed him at the tiny police station, Jim kept glancing toward the door and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The Preservation Society is definitely committed to maintaining the town's character," Jim said, "but sometimes their methods are a bit extreme. They had unofficial power that went far beyond what was written in any town law. If someone wanted to change the color of their shutters or replace their front steps, they needed society approval. If a business wanted to update its sign or modify its storefront, Eleanor Ashworth and her committee had final say. People who ignored these unofficial rules often found themselves facing endless red tape, unexpected tax bills, or mysterious problems with their utilities. Jim told Marcus about a young couple who had moved to Millfield 3 years earlier and bought a rundown house on Maple Street. They had big plans to fix up the property, turning it into a bed and breakfast that would attract tourists interested in the town's historical character. But they made the mistake of starting work without asking the Preservation Society first. Within a week of starting repairs, they were cited for code violations. Their building permits were mysteriously taken away, and their contractor received anonymous threats that convinced him to leave the project. The couple tried to fight the red tape for months, but eventually gave up and sold the house to Eleanor Ashworth's nephew for a fraction of what they had invested. Marcus asked Jim if he had investigated the anonymous threats against the contractor, but the deputy just shrugged. The contractor had never filed an official complaint, and without a formal report, there was nothing to investigate. Besides, Jim added with a bitter smile, the Preservation Society had been very generous to the police department over the years. Their annual fundraising dinner had paid for new equipment, vehicle upgrades, and even Jim's salary increases. It would be difficult to investigate people who were essentially his employers. The conversation with Deputy Kowski left Marcus with more questions than answers, so he decided to dig deeper into the Preservation Society's finances. As a non-profit organization, their tax records were public, but getting them required a formal request to the state. While waiting for those documents, Marcus drove to the county seat and spent a day in the courthouse researching property transfers and business licenses. What he found there made his blood run cold. Over the past 20 years, the Preservation Society had gained ownership of more than 60% of the homes in Millfield. Sometimes these purchases were straightforward, but more often they involved complicated arrangements where the society would buy a mortgage from a bank, then take the house when the owner had financial problems. In several cases, the society had bought properties from families who had suddenly decided to move away from town, often selling for well below market value, as if they were desperate to leave quickly. The pattern became even more disturbing when Marcus cross-checked these property transfers with missing person reports from nearby towns, at least 12 people who had sold property to the Preservation Society had never been seen again after leaving Millfield. Their families had filed missing person reports with state police, but the investigations had gone nowhere. The missing people had apparently withdrawn their savings in cash, left their jobs without notice, and disappeared without contacting relatives or friends. State police had classified these as voluntary disappearances by adults who had chosen to start new lives elsewhere. Marcus tried to contact some of these missing persons' relatives, but the conversations were frustrating and frightening. Family members were reluctant to discuss their missing loved ones, and several people hung up when Marcus said he was a reporter. One woman, the sister of a man who had disappeared after selling his house to the Preservation Society, agreed to meet Marcus at a diner 30 miles from Millfield. She arrived looking over her shoulder and speaking in whispers, clearly terrified that someone might hear their conversation. Her brother had been planning to move to Florida after retiring from his job at the paper mill. She explained he had lived in the same house his whole life, raised his children there after his wife died, and was looking forward to a quiet retirement somewhere warm. But something had changed in his final weeks in Millfield. He became paranoid and jumpy, convinced that people were watching his house and following him around town. He told his sister that he had discovered something terrible about the Preservation Society, something that put him in danger. Before he could explain what he had learned, he was dead. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but his sister had never believed that explanation. Her brother had been in excellent health with no history of heart problems. More importantly, his body had been found in the basement of his house, which made no sense because he never went down there. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, and his arthritis made it hard for him to use them safely. The Preservation Society had arranged for a quick cremation before his sister could request an autopsy, claiming that her brother had specified cremation in a will that no one had ever seen. Marcus left that conversation with a growing certainty that he was investigating something far more sinister than historical preservation. The missing persons, the property takeovers, the incomplete records, and the climate of fear that seemed to fill the town all pointed toward a conspiracy that had been operating for decades. But he needed hard evidence, something more solid than suspicious coincidences and frightened whispers. His breakthrough came when he finally received the Preservation Society's financial records from the state. Hidden among pages of routine expenses and fundraising income was a series of payments to a company called Heritage Transport Services. These payments, totaling more than $800,000 over 5 years, were listed as restoration consulting fees, but the amounts were far too large for any legitimate consulting work. When Marcus researched Heritage Transport Services, he discovered that it was a shell company with no employees, no office, and no real business operations. The company's only listed asset was a fleet of refrigerated trucks. Marcus spent a sleepless night in his hotel room, trying to piece together what he had discovered: a preservation society with access to refrigerated trucks, a pattern of missing persons who had owned valuable property, and a town where asking too many questions could be dangerous. The conclusion was almost too horrible to accept, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Millfield Preservation Society wasn't just preserving historical buildings, they were systematically murdering residents who posed a threat to their operations, then disposing of the bodies while seizing their property. The next morning, Marcus packed his belongings and checked out of his hotel before dawn. He had enough evidence to write his story, but he needed to get far away from Millfield before publishing it. As he drove through the center of town one final time, Eleanor Ashworth stepped out of the historical museum and waved goodbye with her characteristic warm smile. Marcus waved back, fighting the urge to floor the accelerator and flee as fast as his car could carry him. 3 weeks later, Marcus Whitfield's investigative report appeared on the front page of newspapers across New England. Within hours, state and federal law enforcement agencies had launched a massive investigation into the Millfield Preservation Society. What they uncovered was even worse than Marcus had suspected. The society had been operating a sophisticated human trafficking network, kidnapping residents who threatened to expose their activities and selling them to criminal organizations in major cities. The refrigerated trucks were used to transport victims who had been drugged and told they were being moved to new jobs in other states. Eleanor Ashworth and 14 other society members were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and organized crime. The investigation revealed that the society had been responsible for the deaths of at least 37 people over 2 decades. Many of the missing persons had not left town voluntarily. They had been murdered in the basement of the historical museum, their bodies dissolved in acid, and their property seized through fake documents. Marcus Whitfield received a Pulitzer Prize for his investigative reporting, but the recognition brought him no satisfaction. He had exposed a monstrous conspiracy, but he couldn't bring back the victims or undo the years of terror that had gripped Millfield. The town still exists today, its Victorian houses and gas, street lamps preserved exactly as they were, but most of the buildings stand empty now. Few people want to live in a place where a historical preservation society turned into a criminal organization that murdered anyone who threatened their perfect vision of small town. America. Tommy Rodriguez had saved for 3 years to open his auto repair shop in Cedar Grove, Alabama, a small town of 2,156 residents that sat along Highway 82 between Montgomery and Tuscaloosa. The town had seemed perfect for his business when he first visited in the spring of 2021. Main Street still had the bones of prosperity from decades past, with solid brick buildings that had housed successful businesses during the cotton boom years. The rent was affordable. The location had good visibility from the highway, and there was clearly a need for honest car service in a community where many residents drove older vehicles that needed regular maintenance. Tommy had grown up in Birmingham, the son of Mexican immigrants who had taught him the value of hard work and treating customers fairly. He had spent 15 years working for other people's shops, learning every aspect of car repair while saving money and building a reputation for reliable service. When he finally opened Rodriguez Auto Service in a former gas station on the edge of Cedar Grove's downtown area, he felt like he was achieving the American dream his parents had sacrificed so much to make possible. The first few months went exactly as Tommy had hoped. Word spread quickly in the small town that the new mechanic was honest, skilled, and charged fair prices for his work. Farmers brought in their pickup trucks. Elderly residents trusted him with their carefully maintained sedans. And young families appreciated his willingness to explain what was wrong with their vehicles and offer options that fit their budgets. Tommy hired 2 part-time employees and began looking into buying the building that housed his shop. His first meeting with the Cedar Grove Business Alliance came on a hot Tuesday morning in August when a black Cadillac pulled into his parking lot and 3 people in expensive suits got out. The leader was a heavy-set man in his 60s named Frank Buchanan, who introduced himself as the Alliance's executive director. He was with Mayor Patricia Donnelly, a sharp-eyed woman who had held office for 12 years, and a man named Charles Webb, who was identified only as a community stakeholder. Frank Buchanan's manner was friendly but firm, as he explained that the Business Alliance served as an unofficial chamber of commerce for Cedar Grove, helping coordinate economic development and ensuring that new businesses fit successfully into the community. Every business owner in town was expected to join the Alliance and participate in their activities, which included monthly meetings, community fundraising events, and cooperative advertising campaigns that promoted Cedar Grove as a destination for shoppers and tourists. The membership fee was $500 per month, plus additional fees for special projects and community improvements. In exchange, Alliance members received priority for city contracts, favorable treatment in zoning and permit applications, and protection from unfair competition. Frank emphasized that last point with particular intensity, explaining that the Alliance worked hard to ensure that established businesses were not undercut by newcomers who didn't understand local market conditions. Tommy politely declined to join the Alliance, explaining that he preferred to focus on providing good service to his customers rather than participating in business politics. His shop was doing well on its own, he said, and he didn't see the need to pay monthly fees for benefits he didn't require. The 3 visitors exchanged glances at his response, and Mayor Donnelly made a note on a clipboard before they left without further argument. Within a week, Tommy began experiencing problems that seemed designed to drive him out of business. The city building inspector arrived unannounced to conduct a complete review of his shop, citing violations that had never been mentioned during previous inspections. The fire marshal followed 2 days later, ordering costly changes to Tommy's electrical system and threatening to shut down the business if the work wasn't completed within 30 days. Representative from the State Environmental Protection Agency appeared the following week, claiming that someone had reported improper disposal of car fluids. Each inspection resulted in fines and required improvements that cost Tommy thousands of dollars he hadn't budgeted for following regulations. More troubling was the way his customer base began to shrink without explanation. Regular clients stopped bringing their vehicles to his shop, often offering vague excuses about finding service closer to their homes, or deciding to take their cars to dealers in Montgomery instead. Tommy suspected that the Business Alliance was behind his troubles, but he had no proof of coordination between the organization and the various government agencies that were suddenly watching his operations closely. When he complained to city officials about the harassment, he was told that all inspections were routine, and that any business owner who maintained proper standards had nothing to worry about. The situation got worse when Tommy discovered that someone had been spreading rumors about his shop around town. Customers began asking whether it was true that he used cheap parts, that he had been cited for environmental violations, and that his insurance might not cover work done at his facility. Tommy tried to counter these rumors by offering references and guaranteeing his work, but the damage to his reputation was becoming permanent. His breakthrough in understanding the Alliance's methods came when Janet Morris, an elderly woman who had been one of his first customers, stopped by the shop late one evening after closing time. Janet had been bringing her aging Buick to Tommy for routine maintenance, and he had always appreciated her straightforward manner and prompt payment. But she hadn't been to his shop in more than a month. Despite previously scheduling regular appointments, Janet looked nervous as she explained that she had been approached by Frank Buchanan at the grocery store and told that Tommy's shop was under investigation by state authorities for fraudulent business practices. Buchanan had suggested that customers who continued to use Rodriguez Auto Service might face legal problems if the investigation resulted in criminal charges. He had also mentioned that Alliance member businesses offered special discounts to residents who could prove they were supporting local entrepreneurs rather than outside competitors. Tommy was furious, but not surprised by Buchanan's tactics. What shocked him was Janet's revelation about how the Alliance enforced its control over the local economy. Business owners who refused to join the organization found themselves facing not just regulatory harassment and reputation attacks, but direct sabotage of their operations. Janet had heard stories about non-Alliance businesses experiencing break-ins, vandalism, and mysterious equipment failures that forced them to close permanently. The Alliance's power extended far beyond informal influence. Janet explained Frank Buchanan's family had owned the largest employer in Cedar Grove for 3 generations. Textile mill that provided jobs for more than 200 people. Mayor Donnelly's husband was the president of the town's only bank, which held mortgages and business loans for most of the local population. Charles Webb owned the largest farm in the county and controlled agricultural supply contracts that dozens of smaller farmers depended on for their livelihoods. Together, these 3 people and their allies could make life impossible for anyone who challenged their authority. They could deny loans, cancel contracts, eliminate jobs, and coordinate government harassment until their targets had no choice but to leave town or submit to Alliance control. Over the years, they had driven out dozens of potential competitors and forced every remaining business to accept their terms for continued operation in Cedar Grove. Tommy realized that he was facing a choice between joining a criminal conspiracy or losing everything he had worked to build. The Alliance was essentially running a protection racket that extorted monthly payments from business owners in exchange for allowing them to operate without interference. Business owners who paid the fees received special treatment and protection from competition, while those who refused were systematically destroyed through coordinated attacks on their finances, reputation, and physical property. The decision became easier when Tommy discovered evidence of the Alliance's most serious crime. While researching property records at the courthouse, he found documentation of suspicious ownership transfers involving businesses that had been forced to close after refusing to join the Alliance. In each case, the failed business had been purchased at a fraction of its value by shell companies that were later revealed to be controlled by Alliance members. Even more disturbing was a pattern of insurance claims filed by Alliance members whose properties had suffered convenient accidents that eliminated competition. A restaurant that refused to join the Alliance had burned down under mysterious circumstances, with the insurance payout allowing the owner of an Alliance member restaurant to expand into the empty location. A competing auto repair shop had been destroyed by a gas explosion that investigators said was caused by equipment malfunction, despite the owner's insistence that the equipment had been recently inspected and properly maintained. Tommy began secretly documenting his interactions with Alliance members and government officials, recording conversations and photographing evidence of the coordinated harassment he was experiencing. He also reached out to business owners in neighboring towns who had dealt with similar organizations, hoping to build a case that would expose the Alliance's illegal activities. His investigation revealed that the Cedar Grove Business Alliance was part of a larger network of similar groups operating throughout rural Alabama. These groups used identical tactics to control local economies, sharing strategies and resources to eliminate competition and maximize profits for their members. The network included corrupt officials at multiple levels of government, creating a system of protection that made it extremely difficult for victims to find help through normal legal channels. Tommy's evidence gathering was interrupted when his shop was broken into on a Sunday night in October. The intruders hadn't stolen anything of obvious value, but they had gone through his filing cabinets and office computer, clearly searching for specific information. Tommy realized that the Alliance had discovered his investigation and would soon increase their efforts to force him out of business. Rather than wait for the situation to get worse, Tommy contacted the FBI field office in Birmingham and requested a meeting with agents who specialized in organized crime and public corruption cases. The evidence he had collected, combined with similar complaints from business owners in other towns, provided the foundation for a federal investigation that would eventually expose the Alliance's criminal activities. The FBI investigation revealed that the Cedar Grove Business Alliance and its affiliated organizations had been operating what amounted to a criminal enterprise for more than 20 years. Frank Buchanan, Mayor Patricia Donnelly, Charles Webb, and 14 other Alliance members were charged with racketeering, extortion, conspiracy, and arson. The investigation also resulted in corruption charges against officials from multiple government agencies who had participated in the harassment of non-compliant business owners. Tommy Rodriguez eventually reopened his auto repair shop after the Alliance leadership was arrested, but the experience had changed his view of small-town America. He had discovered that the picturesque communities shown in movies and television shows could hide sophisticated criminal organizations that controlled every aspect of local economic life. The American dream was still possible, but only for those willing to fight against the forces that sought to turn entrepreneurship into extortion and community cooperation into criminal conspiracy. Cedar Grove today is slowly recovering from decades of Alliance control, but the town's economy remains fragile. Many businesses that were driven out during the Alliance's reign of terror never returned, leaving empty storefronts along Main Street as monuments to the entrepreneurs who refused to pay protection money to criminals who hid behind the respectable appearance of business development and community service. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by the gaps in local history, the stories that communities preferred not to remember. As a professor of American Studies at Kansas State University, she had spent her career researching the darker chapters of small-town life that were often left out of official records and cleaned up historical accounts. When the Harmony Historical Committee invited her to research and write a commemorative book for the town's 50th anniversary celebration, she saw it as an opportunity to explore the social dynamics of a community that had remained remarkably isolated despite being only 40 miles from Topeka. Harmony, Kansas, had a population of 934 residents, most of whom could trace their family roots in the area back at least 3 generations. The town had been founded in 1873 by German immigrants who had purchased a large piece of prairie land from the railroad company. Unlike many Kansas settlements that had boomed and busted with agricultural cycles, Harmony had maintained steady population and relative prosperity through careful community planning and conservative financial management. The historical committee was led by Councilman Robert Hayes, whose great-grandfather had been one of the town's original settlers. Robert was a soft-spoken man in his 50s who ran the local insurance agency and had served on the city council for more than a decade. He explained that the committee wanted a complete history that would celebrate Harmony's achievements while preserving the stories of families who had built the community over 5 generations. Sarah was given access to the town's archives, housed in the basement of the public library under the supervision of Grace Peterson, the head librarian who had worked there for 37 years. The collection included city council minutes, school board records, church registers, and hundreds of photographs documenting community events from the late 1800s through the present day. Grace was knowledgeable and helpful, but Sarah noticed that certain periods in the town's history were poorly documented compared to others. The most obvious gap occurred during the 1960s, when Harmony had experienced significant changes that were mentioned in passing but never explained in detail. References in city council minutes suggested major population turnover, property sales, and the establishment of new community organizations. But the supporting documents that would explain these changes were missing from the archives. Grace explained that there had been a flood in the library basement during the 1980s, and many older records had been damaged beyond recovery. Sarah began interviewing long-time residents to fill in the gaps in the written record, but she quickly ran into resistance when she asked about the 1960s. Elderly residents would become vague and uncomfortable when discussing that period, offering generic statements about difficult times and community challenges without providing specific details. Younger residents seemed genuinely unaware that anything significant had happened, suggesting that the story had been deliberately forgotten rather than passed down through families. Her breakthrough came when she discovered a private collection of documents in the estate of a woman who had died the previous year. The woman's daughter, who was cleaning out her mother's house before putting it on the market, had found a box of newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes that her mother had apparently hidden in the attic. The daughter offered to let Sarah examine the materials, hoping that they might be useful for the historical project. The documents painted a disturbing picture of events that had occurred in Harmony during the summer of 1965, according to newspaper accounts from surrounding towns. Harmony had been the site of a mass disappearance that had attracted attention from state and federal law enforcement agencies. 13 families, totaling 57 individuals, had vanished from the community over a period of 6 weeks. Their houses had been left undisturbed, their belongings intact, and their bank accounts untouched. But the people themselves had simply disappeared without explanation. The missing families had all been relative newcomers to Harmony. Having moved to the area within the previous 5 years, they represented different backgrounds and economic circumstances. But they shared one characteristic that set them apart from long-time residents. They had all expressed interest in modernizing various aspects of community life, from updating the school curriculum to allowing Sunday shopping to permitting social dancing at community events. Their disappearances had effectively ended all discussion of social changes that might challenge Harmony's traditional values. Sarah found additional documentation in old Kansas City newspapers that had covered the story as a regional Mystery State Police had conducted a massive investigation, interviewing hundreds of residents and searching thousands of acres of farmland for evidence of what had happened to the missing families. The investigation had been hampered by the community's insistence that the families had simply decided to move elsewhere. Despite the lack of evidence supporting voluntary relocation, the newspaper coverage revealed details that made Sarah's blood run cold. Several of the missing families had told friends and relatives in other towns that they were planning to stay in Harmony permanently, having made significant investments in local property and businesses. Some had enrolled their children in school for the upcoming academic year. One family had been in the process of building a new house, with construction materials already delivered to their lot when they disappeared. Even more disturbing was the timing of the disappearances, which had occurred shortly after the missing families had begun organizing to challenge certain community decisions. They had questioned the historical committee's control over property development, objected to religious requirements for participation in civic activities, and advocated for more inclusive policies regarding newcomers who didn't share the community's German Lutheran heritage. Sarah realized that she had stumbled upon evidence of what appeared to be systematic elimination of community members who threatened the established social order. The historical committee, rather than being a harmless organization dedicated to preserving local culture, seemed to have been the coordinating body for a conspiracy that had resulted in the disappearance of nearly 60 people. Her investigation took a dangerous turn when she tried to verify details from the newspaper accounts by examining official records in the county courthouse. The sheriff's department files from 1965 were missing, apparently lost during an office renovation in the early 1990s. Property records showed that the homes and businesses owned by the missing families had been sold within months of their disappearances. But the sales had been handled through a legal process that seemed designed to hide the actual buyers. Sarah discovered that most of the missing families' property had eventually ended up in the hands of long-time Harmony residents, often at prices well below market value. The transactions had been processed through a law firm in Topeka that had since closed, and the attorney who had handled the sales had died years earlier. The pattern suggested systematic theft of property from families who were no longer alive to protect their interests. When Sarah tried to discuss her findings with Robert Hayes, his reaction confirmed her worst suspicions about the historical committee's involvement in the cover-up. Hayes became agitated and defensive, insisting that Sarah was misinterpreting historical events and drawing conclusions that weren't supported by reliable evidence. He suggested that she focus her research on more positive aspects of Harmony's development, particularly the community's achievements in agriculture and education. Hayes also mentioned that the committee had concerns about Sarah's research methods and wondered whether she was the right person to write the commemorative book. Other committee members had expressed reservations about working with an outside researcher who might not understand the community's values and priorities. Perhaps it would be better to find a local writer who had deeper connections to Harmony and greater appreciation for its traditions. Sarah understood the implicit threat in Hayes's comments, but she was determined to uncover the truth about what had happened to the missing families. She began working secretly, making copies of documents and conducting interviews outside of Harmony to avoid alerting committee members to the direction of her investigation. She also contacted law enforcement agencies to inquire about reopening the case, but was told that the statute of limitations had expired for most potential crimes and that the lack of physical evidence made prosecution impossible. Her research revealed that the disappearances in 1965 had not been an isolated incident. Similar patterns of sudden population turnover had occurred in Harmony during other periods when community cohesion had been threatened by outside influences. During the Great Depression, several families who had advocated for federal assistance programs had mysteriously relocated. In the early 1950s, supporters of racial integration had left town abruptly after the Supreme Court's desegregation decisions. The Historical Committee had been involved in all of these episodes, serving as the unofficial authority that determined which residents were welcome in Harmony and which posed a threat to community stability. The committee's power came from its control over local institutions, including the school board, city council, and various business organizations. Members could effectively ostracize targeted families by denying them employment, services, and social acceptance until they had no choice but to leave. Sarah's final discovery came when she found evidence that the Historical Committee's activities had continued into recent decades. Though with less dramatic methods than mass disappearance, families who challenged community decisions or advocated for unwelcome changes were systematically harassed until they chose to relocate. Their departure was then explained as voluntary decisions to pursue better opportunities elsewhere, maintaining the fiction that Harmony was a harmonious community where everyone was welcome. When Sarah attempted to present her findings to law enforcement officials, she learned that several key figures in the county sheriff's department were related to current and former historical committee members. Her investigation had been monitored from the beginning, and community leaders were already taking steps to discredit her research and prevent publication of her discoveries. Sarah Mitchell never completed the commemorative history of Harmony, Kansas. She resigned from the project after receiving threats against her family and being informed that her academic position might be endangered if she continued pursuing her research. The Historical Committee eventually hired a local writer to produce a cleaned-up account of the town's development that made no mention of the missing families or the systematic elimination of dissenting residents. The commemorative book was published in time for Harmony's 150th anniversary celebration, filled with photographs of smiling families and heartwarming stories about community cooperation. Visitors to the celebration commented on how well preserved the town appeared and how friendly the residents were. Few of them realized they were walking through a community where challenging the established order could still prove fatal for those naive enough to believe that American small towns were actually the democratic, inclusive places they pretended to be. Jennifer Walsh thought she had finally found the perfect suburban paradise when she moved to Willowbrook, Ohio, in the spring of 2022. The town of 3,511 residents sat in a wealthy pocket of rolling hills 30 minutes outside Columbus, where tree-lined streets wound past carefully maintained colonial and Tudor-style homes. Every yard featured professionally landscaped gardens, and the downtown area looked like something from a lifestyle magazine. With its boutique shops, artisan coffee houses, and weekly farmers market, Jennifer had relocated from Chicago after accepting a marketing position with a technology company that allowed remote work. She was recently divorced, eager for a fresh start, and drawn to Willowbrook's reputation as a safe, family-friendly community where neighbors still looked out for one another. The house she purchased was a 1920s brick colonial on Maple Avenue, complete with a wraparound porch and a backyard garden that the previous owners had maintained with obvious pride and considerable skill. Within days of moving in, Jennifer received a handwritten invitation to join the Willowbrook Garden Club. delivered to her door by an elegant woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Victoria Sterling. The club had been founded in 1948, Victoria explained, and had grown to include most of the women in Willowbrook who took pride in their homes and gardens. Members met twice monthly for educational programs, social activities, and community service projects that kept the town looking beautiful year-round. The monthly dues were modest, Victoria said, and the club offered numerous benefits, including group discounts at local nurseries, access to gardening expertise from master gardener members, and participation in the annual home and garden tour that was Willowbrook's premier social event. More importantly, club membership provided opportunities to connect with other women who shared interests in creating beautiful living spaces and maintaining community standards that preserved property values for everyone. Jennifer was pleased to be welcomed so quickly into the community and accepted the invitation without hesitation. Her first garden club meeting was held in the social hall of the Presbyterian Church, where 35 women gathered for coffee, pastries, and a presentation about native Ohio wildflowers. The atmosphere was warm and sophisticated, with members dressed in the sort of understated, expensive clothing that suggested comfortable financial circumstances without showing off. Victoria Sterling clearly commanded respect as the club's president, a position she had held for more than a decade. She conducted meetings with parliamentary efficiency, announced upcoming events with the confidence of someone used to having her decisions accepted without question, and gave gardening advice with the authority of genuine expertise. Other members deferred to her opinions and competed for her approval in ways that reminded Jennifer of high school social dynamics. Though executed with the polish that came with decades of adult refinement, the club's community service projects were impressive in scope and impact. Members organized neighborhood cleanups, maintained flower gardens in public spaces, and worked with city officials to ensure that Willowbrook's standards for property maintenance were enforced consistently. The club also operated an informal welcome committee that helped new residents fit into the community while learning about local expectations. For home and garden care, Jennifer enjoyed the social aspects of club membership and found that belonging to the organization opened doors throughout. Willowbrook. Shopkeepers were friendlier. Service providers gave priority to club members, and her neighbors treated her with the sort of respect that came from being accepted by the community's unofficial leadership. The garden club clearly wielded influence that extended far beyond horticulture and home decoration. Her first indication that the club's activities might include darker elements came during a discussion about a family that had recently moved away from Willowbrook. The Hendersons had lived on Jennifer Street in a beautiful Tudor revival house that should have been a perfect fit for the neighborhood's aesthetic standards. But according to whispered conversations during coffee hour, the family had struggled to maintain their property properly and had made several landscaping choices that other residents found inappropriate. The Hendersons had planted vegetables in their front yard, installed solar panels on their roof, and allowed their children to play in ways that other neighbors considered too loud and disruptive. More problematically, Mrs. Henderson had declined to join the garden club despite multiple invitations, explaining that she preferred to focus her volunteer time on environmental activism and social justice causes that she considered more important than neighborhood beautification. According to Victoria Sterling, the Hendersons had eventually realized that Willowbrook wasn't the right community for their lifestyle and had decided to relocate somewhere more compatible with their values. Their house had sold quickly to a lovely family who already understood the importance of maintaining neighborhood standards. Jennifer found the story troubling because she remembered the Hendersons mentioning their love for their home and their plans to live there permanently. But she assumed that circumstances had changed in ways that outsiders might not understand. Her concerns deepened when she witnessed the garden club's response to another family whose property maintenance had become problematic. The Kramers lived in a 1930s colonial that had been beautifully maintained until Mr. Kramer developed health issues that made it difficult for him to care for his extensive gardens. The couple was elderly and living on a fixed income that didn't allow for professional landscaping services, so their once pristine yard gradually became overgrown and cluttered with equipment they could no longer manage. Rather than offering help to the struggling elderly couple, several garden club members began a campaign of subtle harassment designed to pressure them into selling their home. Anonymous complaints were filed with city code enforcement, resulting in violation notices for minor infractions that had been ignored when the property was well maintained. Neighbors began commenting loudly about declining property values whenever they passed the Kramer house, ensuring that the elderly couple could hear their disapproval. Jennifer suggested that the garden club organize volunteers to help the Kramers maintain their yard, but Victoria Sterling dismissed the idea with a cold smile. The club's mission was to preserve community standards, not to enable residents who couldn't meet their responsibilities. If the Kramers were no longer capable of maintaining their property properly, the kindest thing would be to help them realize that they needed to move to a more appropriate living situation. The systematic campaign against the Kramers escalated when the couple received a letter from their homeowner's insurance company, threatening to cancel their coverage due to safety hazards that had been reported by anonymous neighbors. Their property taxes were reassessed at a higher rate despite the obvious decline in their home's condition. Contractors who had previously provided services to the couple suddenly became unavailable or dramatically increased their prices. Within 6 months, the Kramers had sold their home to a developer who renovated it extensively before selling it to a young family who immediately joined the garden club and began participating enthusiastically in community activities. Jennifer never learned where the elderly couple had moved, and none of the garden club members seemed interested in maintaining contact with them after they left Willowbrook. The pattern became clear when Jennifer began paying attention to other families who had left the community during her first year in Willowbrook. In each case, the departed residents had somehow failed to meet unstated but strictly enforced standards for property maintenance, lifestyle choices, or social participation. Families with children who were too loud, homeowners who chose unconventional landscaping, and residents who declined to participate in community organizations all eventually moved away after experiencing various forms of pressure that made their lives increasingly difficult. Jennifer's investigation into the garden club's activities took a dangerous turn when she discovered evidence of the organization's most serious crimes. While volunteering to help organize club records, she found files documenting systematic surveillance of residents who were considered problematic. The files contained photographs of properties, records of visitors and activities, and detailed notes about family dynamics and financial circumstances. Even more disturbing were records showing that garden club members had coordinated with local officials to ensure that targeted residents faced bureaucratic obstacles, tax assessments, and regulatory problems that would pressure them to relocate. The club maintained relationships with code enforcement officers, assessors, and service providers who were willing to participate in campaigns against families who didn't conform to community expectations. The most shocking discovery was evidence that the Garden Club had been responsible for several deaths that had been classified as accidents or natural causes. Elderly residents who refused to sell their homes despite pressure campaigns had died under suspicious circumstances, often after experiencing health emergencies that prevented them from calling for help in time to survive. Jennifer found documentation of at least 6 deaths over the past decade that followed the same pattern. Elderly homeowners who had been targeted by the Garden Club would experience sudden health crises, often involving falls or medication errors that resulted in delayed discovery and fatal outcomes. In each case, the deceased person's property was quickly purchased by buyers who had connections to Garden Club members. When Jennifer tried to research these deaths by reviewing newspaper obituaries and public records, she discovered that Detective Mike O'Brien, who had investigated several of the cases, was married to a prominent Garden Club member. The detective had consistently concluded that the deaths were accidental, despite evidence that might have supported more thorough investigations. Jennifer realized that she had uncovered a criminal conspiracy that used the respectable appearance of a suburban women's organization to systematically control who was allowed to live in Willowbrook. The Garden Club operated as an enforcement mechanism that eliminated residents who threatened property values, social cohesion, or the established power structure that kept the community exclusive and carefully controlled. Her attempt to expose the Garden Club's activities nearly cost Jennifer her life. After she contacted law enforcement officials outside of Willowbrook's jurisdiction, she began experiencing the same types of harassment that had been used against other targeted residents. Her home was vandalized, her car was sabotaged, and she received anonymous threats warning her to stop spreading false accusations against respected community members. The situation escalated when Jennifer returned home from work to find that someone had entered her house and left a potted plant on her kitchen table. The plant was a beautiful arrangement of oleander flowers, which Jennifer recognized as highly poisonous. The message was clear. The Garden Club had the ability to enter her home at will and possessed knowledge that could be used to eliminate her if she continued threatening their operations. Jennifer contacted the FBI and provided evidence of the Garden Club's criminal activities. But the investigation was complicated by the organization's deep connections throughout Willowbrook's government and law enforcement agencies. Several Garden Club members were wives of city officials, and the organization's charitable activities had created relationships with politicians and community leaders who were reluctant to believe that their neighbors were capable of systematic murder. The federal investigation eventually resulted in arrests of Victoria Sterling and 11 other Garden Club members on charges, including conspiracy, elder abuse, insurance fraud, and multiple counts of murder. The evidence revealed that the organization had been responsible for at least 14 deaths over 15 years, using various methods to eliminate residents who posed threats to their vision of suburban perfection. Jennifer Walsh moved away from Willowbrook before the trials concluded, unable to continue living in a community where beautification projects had provided cover for systematic elimination of unwanted neighbors. The Garden Club's legacy continues to influence the town, where property values remain high and gardens remain perfectly maintained, but where potential residents are carefully screened to ensure they understand the true cost of suburban paradise. Kevin Murphy should have known something was wrong when the invitation arrived in his mailbox on expensive letterhead bearing the Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge crest. He had never heard of the organization despite having hunted throughout Idaho for more than 20 years, and the invitation was addressed to him personally rather than sent to the general membership of any hunting club he belonged to. The letter praised his reputation as an ethical hunter and outdoor enthusiast, extending an exclusive invitation to participate in a special hunting event that would take place on private land near Pine Valley, a remote town of 678 residents in the central part of the state. The invitation was signed by William Crenshaw, who identified himself as the lodge's master, and included detailed information about lodging, meals, and equipment that would be provided during the 3-day event. Participants were asked to bring only personal clothing and hunting licenses, as all firearms, ammunition, and specialized gear would be supplied by the lodge. The fee for the event was surprisingly modest, barely enough to cover basic expenses, and the letter emphasized that this was an opportunity for serious hunters to experience something truly unique. Kevin was intrigued despite his natural skepticism about unsolicited invitations. He had recently retired from his job as a Forest Service ranger and was looking for new outdoor adventures to fill his time. The Pine Valley area was beautiful but sparsely populated, offering the kind of pristine wilderness experience that was becoming increasingly rare as Idaho's outdoor recreation industry attracted more visitors each year. He accepted the invitation and arranged to drive to Pine Valley on the designated weekend in October. The town itself was exactly what Kevin expected from a small Idaho community. Main Street consisted of a few blocks of weathered buildings housing a general store, a cafe, a gas station, and a handful of other businesses that served the needs of local ranchers and loggers. The Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge sat on a hill overlooking the town, a massive log structure that looked like it had been built in the 1920s as a retreat for wealthy hunters from cities like Boise and Salt Lake City. Kevin was met at the lodge by William Crenshaw, a distinguished man in his 70s who carried himself with the bearing of someone used to command. Crenshaw had the weathered complexion and confident manner of a lifelong outdoorsman, and his knowledge of hunting techniques and wildlife behavior was immediately apparent in their conversation. He explained that the lodge had been operating for more than 50 years, hosting exclusive hunting events for members who shared a commitment to traditional outdoor values and ethical hunting practices. The other participants in the weekend event were an interesting mix of hunters from across the Western United States. They included a retired military officer from Colorado, a successful businessman from Utah, a rancher from Montana, and several other men whose outdoor experience and financial means were obvious in their conversation and equipment. All seemed to have been carefully selected for the event, though none could explain exactly how they had been identified and invited by the lodge. The first day of the event followed a traditional format that Kevin found familiar and comfortable. Participants were divided into small groups and assigned to different hunting areas on the lodge's extensive private property. The terrain was spectacular, with dense forests, alpine meadows, and steep ridges that provided opportunities to hunt elk, deer, and other game species that were abundant in the area. Kevin's group was successful in harvesting 2 elk, and the evening meal featured venison from previous hunts, along with stories and friendship around the lodge's massive stone fireplace. The second day began to reveal disturbing aspects of the lodge's activities that Kevin hadn't anticipated. Rather than continuing with traditional hunting, participants were introduced to what Crenshaw described as advanced hunting techniques that tested their skills against more challenging prey. The morning briefing included detailed maps of unfamiliar terrain and references to hunting methods that seemed to go beyond normal outdoor practices. Kevin's unease grew when he was issued equipment that seemed excessive for hunting wildlife. In addition to a high-powered rifle and normal hunting gear, he was given night vision equipment, tracking devices, and communication radios that suggested they would be pursuing prey that was far more dangerous than deer or elk. When Kevin asked about the unusual equipment, Crenshaw explained that the lodge specialized in hunting experiences that pushed participants to their limits and tested their skills against worthy adversaries. The hunting area for the second day was located deep in the wilderness, accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles that transported participants to a remote staging area before dawn. Kevin found himself paired with the retired military officer, a man named Colonel Richards, who seemed familiar with the lodge's more advanced hunting techniques. Richards explained that the Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge was known among certain hunting circles for offering experiences that couldn't be found anywhere else. Hunting opportunities that attracted serious outdoorsmen who were looking for the ultimate test of their skills. Kevin began to understand what those hunting opportunities involved when they encountered the first piece of evidence that they weren't hunting animals. Hidden in dense brush near a creek was a campsite that showed signs of recent human habitation. The site included a tent, camping gear, and personal belongings that suggested someone had been living in the wilderness for several days. The camp appeared to have been abandoned hastily, with food still scattered around a cold fire pit and clothing left hanging from tree branches. Colonel Richards examined the campsite with professional thoroughness, pointing out details that Kevin would have missed. The person who had been living here was inexperienced in wilderness survival, Richards explained, based on poor site selection, inadequate shelter construction, and careless disposal of waste that would attract predators. More importantly, the individual was probably still in the area, having fled the campsite recently enough that tracks and other signs were still fresh. Kevin realized with growing horror that they weren't hunting wildlife at all, but were participating in some kind of human hunting activity. The prey that Crenshaw had described as worthy adversaries were people, probably individuals who had been brought to the remote wilderness area specifically to be hunted by paying customers who wanted the ultimate outdoor experience. The expensive equipment, the careful selection of participants, and the remote location all made sense when viewed as components of organized human hunting rather than legitimate outdoor recreation. His attempts to withdraw from the activity were met with firm resistance from Colonel Richards, who explained that participants who discovered the true nature of the lodge's activities weren't permitted to leave until the hunting event was completed. Kevin was now a witness to criminal activity that couldn't be allowed to report what he had seen to outside authorities. He would need to participate fully in the hunt, demonstrate his commitment to the lodge's special brotherhood, and prove that he could be trusted to maintain the secrecy that protected the organization's operations. The hunt continued throughout the day as Kevin and Colonel Richards tracked their human prey through increasingly rugged terrain. Their quarry was a young woman who had been surviving in the wilderness for several days, probably after being released, with minimal equipment, and told that she would be hunted by armed men who considered her elimination a recreational activity. Kevin could see evidence of her growing desperation in the tracks and campsites they discovered, signs that she was becoming exhausted and making increasingly poor decisions in her efforts to evade capture. Kevin tried to sabotage the hunt by providing false information about tracks and suggesting wrong directions when Colonel Richards consulted him about their prey's likely movements. But Richards was experienced enough to recognize Kevin's deception, and by afternoon it became clear that Kevin's own survival might depend on his cooperation. Richards made subtle but unmistakable threats about what happened to lodge participants who proved unreliable or who threatened the organization's security. The hunt reached its climax near sunset when they tracked their prey to a rocky outcrop where she had taken shelter in a small cave. Colonel Richards positioned Kevin to block one escape route while he approached the cave from another direction, intending to force the woman into the open where she could be easily shot. Kevin found himself facing an impossible choice between participating in murder or risking his own life by refusing to cooperate with the hunt. His decision was made when Game Warden Lisa Zhang appeared unexpectedly on the ridge above their position, apparently investigating reports of illegal hunting activity in the area. Zhang was armed and clearly suspicious of what she had observed, demanding identification from Kevin and Colonel Richards while positioning herself to cover both men with her sidearm. Kevin realized that the Game Warden's arrival provided his only opportunity to escape from the hunting lodge's criminal activities and expose what he had witnessed. Kevin quickly explained to Lisa Zhang that he had been deceived about the nature of the hunting event and that there was a woman hiding in the cave who was being hunted by lodge members. Colonel Richards tried to convince the Game Warden that Kevin was suffering from altitude sickness and confusion, but Zhang was experienced enough to recognize the signs of criminal activity when she saw them. She radioed for backup while maintaining control over both men, and within hours, the remote hunting area was swarming with law enforcement officers. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge's criminal operations. The organization had been operating a human hunting business for more than 15 years, kidnapping victims from other states and transporting them to Idaho, where wealthy clients paid enormous fees to hunt them through remote wilderness areas. The victims were typically homeless individuals, runaway teenagers, and other people whose disappearances wouldn't trigger immediate law enforcement investigations. Lodge Master William Crenshaw and 17 other members were arrested on charges including kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder. The investigation revealed that the lodge had been responsible for the deaths of at least 43 people over 15 years, operating under the cover of a legitimate hunting organization while providing the ultimate outdoor experience for clients who had grown bored with hunting animals. Kevin Murphy's testimony was crucial in convicting the lodge members, but the experience left him unable to continue hunting for recreation. He had discovered that his beloved outdoor activities could be perverted into something monstrous by people who viewed human life as just another form of game to be pursued and killed for entertainment. The Pine Valley Sportsman's Lodge building still stands on its hill overlooking the town, but it has been abandoned since the arrests, serving as a reminder that even the most respected community organizations can hide unspeakable evil behind facades of tradition and respectability. The small town of Pine Valley has struggled to recover from the revelation that one of its most prominent institutions was actually a criminal enterprise that murdered dozens of innocent people. Many residents had known about the lodge's exclusive hunting events, but had never suspected that the wealthy visitors were paying to hunt human beings rather than wildlife. The economic impact of losing the lodge's business has been devastating for local merchants and service providers who had depended on the income generated by the organization's activities. Game Warden Lisa Zhang received commendations for her role. in exposing the lodge's crimes, but she too was affected by the discovery that a trusted community institution had been operating a systematic murder business. Her investigation revealed that several local officials had been aware of suspicious activities at the lodge, but had chosen to ignore them because of the economic benefits the organization brought to the community. The corruption and willful blindness that had enabled the lodge's operations for so many years demonstrated how easily small communities could become complicit in unspeakable crimes when those crimes were committed by wealthy and respected organizations. Michelle Thompson had been looking for meaningful volunteer work since moving to Maplewood, Wisconsin, a picturesque town of 1,789 residents nestled among rolling hills covered with maple and oak forests. Her husband's promotion had brought them from Milwaukee to this charming community, where Main Street was lined with well-preserved 19th century buildings, and neighbors still waved to each other from their front porches. Michelle had always believed in giving back to the community, and the Maplewood Service League seemed like the perfect organization to channel her desire to help others. The Service League had been operating for more than 30 years, providing a wide range of charitable services to families in need throughout the region. Their programs included a food pantry, emergency assistance for families facing financial crisis, after-school tutoring for struggling students, and a summer camp program that served children from low-income households. The organization was highly respected throughout central Wisconsin, regularly receiving grants from foundations and government agencies that recognized their effective work addressing poverty and social problems in rural communities. Hannah Brooks, the Service League's executive director, was an impressive woman in her 50s who had dedicated her career to non-profit work. She had founded the organization after recognizing that small towns like Maplewood often lacked the social services available in larger cities, leaving vulnerable families with nowhere to turn when they encountered difficulties. Under her leadership, the Service League had grown from a small volunteer group into a professionally managed organization with an annual budget of more than $2 million and programs that served hundreds of families each year. Michelle was immediately impressed by the scope and effectiveness of the Service League's work when she attended her first volunteer orientation session. The organization operated out of a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, with separate areas for food distribution, clothing donations, administrative offices, and program activities. The facility was bustling with activity as volunteers sorted donations, prepared meals, and coordinated services for clients who arrived throughout the day seeking assistance. Hannah Brooks explained that the Service League served families from a wide geographic area, including many clients who traveled from other counties to access services that weren't available in their home communities. The organization had developed a reputation for providing help without judgment, offering assistance to anyone who needed it, regardless of their circumstances or background. This approach had made the Service League particularly effective at reaching families who might be reluctant to seek help from government agencies or traditional charities. Michelle was assigned to work with the organization's Family Assistance program, which provided emergency help to households facing immediate crisis, such as eviction, utility shutoffs, or medical emergencies. Her role involved interviewing clients to assess their needs, connecting them with appropriate resources, and following up to ensure that the assistance had been effective. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply rewarding, as Michelle was able to see the immediate impact of her efforts on families who were struggling to survive. During her first few weeks as a volunteer, Michelle was struck by the number of families with children who sought help from the Service League. Many of these families were headed by single mothers who were working multiple jobs but still unable to make ends meet in an economy that offered few opportunities for people without college degrees. The children in these families often showed signs of chronic stress and malnutrition, and Michelle was moved by their resilience in the face of circumstances that would challenge most adults. Hannah Brooks seemed particularly committed to helping children, often spending extra time with young clients and ensuring that they received not just material assistance, but also emotional support and encouragement. She frequently mentioned her own difficult childhood in conversations with volunteers, explaining that her personal experiences had motivated her to dedicate her life to protecting vulnerable children from the kind of trauma and neglect she had endured. This personal connection to the work made her an inspiring leader who attracted dedicated volunteers and generous donors. Michelle's first indication that something was wrong with the Service League's operations came when she noticed inconsistencies in the way certain families were treated by the organization. Some clients received extensive assistance and ongoing support, while others were provided with minimal help and seemed to be discouraged from returning for additional services. The differences didn't seem to be based on need or circumstances, as some of the families who received less assistance appeared to be in more desperate situations than those who received preferential treatment. When Michelle asked Hannah Brooks about these disparities, she was told that the organization had to make difficult decisions about resource allocation, and that some families were better able to benefit from assistance than others. Families who demonstrated commitment to improving their situations and who followed the Service League's recommendations were more likely to receive ongoing support, while those who seemed unable or unwilling to make positive changes were provided with temporary help but not long-term investment. Michelle found this explanation troubling because it seemed to contradict the Service League's stated mission of helping anyone who needed assistance. She began paying closer attention to which families received different levels of service and gradually realized that the pattern was more disturbing than simple resource allocation decisions. Families with children who were particularly attractive or well-behaved seemed to receive more attention from Hannah Brooks and other staff members, while families with children who were shy, traumatized, or difficult to manage were often provided with minimal assistance. Her concerns deepened when she noticed that some of the children who participated in the Service League's programs seemed to develop unusually close relationships with staff members and volunteers. These children would arrive early for activities and stay late after programs ended, spending time in private conversations with adults who showed them special attention and provided them with gifts and privileges that weren't available to other participants. Michelle recognized these patterns from her training as a teacher, where she had learned to identify potential signs of inappropriate relationships between adults and children. The situation became more alarming when Michelle discovered that the Service League maintained detailed files on all the families they served, including photographs and personal information that seemed to go far beyond what was necessary for providing assistance. The files contained observations about family dynamics, assessments of parents' capabilities and reliability, and detailed descriptions of children's personalities, appearance, and behavior. Some files included notes about which children might be suitable for the organization's special programs that weren't described in any of the Service League's public materials. Michelle's investigation into these special programs revealed that the Service League was operating activities that weren't disclosed to volunteers, donors, or the families they served. Children who were identified as suitable candidates were invited to participate in overnight camps, weekend trips, and other activities that removed them from their families for extended periods. These programs were described to parents as educational and recreational opportunities that would benefit children who came from disadvantaged backgrounds. But the actual activities weren't documented in any materials that Michelle could access. When Michelle tried to learn more about these special programs by asking other volunteers, she encountered evasive responses and suggestions that she should focus on her assigned duties rather than asking questions about activities that didn't concern her. Hannah Brooks became noticeably cooler toward Michelle after she began inquiring about the undisclosed programs, and other staff members seemed to be monitoring her interactions with clients and her access to organizational records. Michelle's breakthrough came when she was approached by a former client whose daughter had participated in one of the Service League's special programs several years earlier. The woman had been reluctant to speak about her experiences with the organization, but she had become increasingly concerned about what had happened to her daughter during the time she had spent in the Service League's care. The child had returned from the special programs changed, exhibiting signs of trauma and refusing to discuss what had occurred during her participation. The former client explained that several other families had similar experiences with children who had participated in the Service League's special programs. The children had been selected based on their vulnerability and their families' desperate need for assistance, making it unlikely that parents would ask difficult questions or make complaints about the organization's activities. The programs had provided opportunities for adults to abuse children who had no other sources of support and whose families were dependent on the Service League's assistance. Michelle realized that the Service League was operating as a front for a child trafficking and abuse network that used charitable programs to identify and access vulnerable children. The organization's reputation for helping families in need provided perfect cover for criminal activities, as parents were grateful for assistance and unlikely to question the motives of people who were providing their children with opportunities they couldn't afford. The detailed files maintained by the organization were actually profiles used to select children for abuse and to assess their families' likelihood of reporting suspicious activities. Her attempt to report these discoveries to local law enforcement was complicated by the fact that Police Chief Anthony Silva was a long-time supporter of the Service League, who had received several community service awards from the organization. Silva was reluctant to investigate Michelle's allegations, suggesting that she had misunderstood the Service League's activities and was making unfounded accusations against respected community members who had dedicated their lives to helping others. Michelle's investigation revealed that the Service League's criminal activities extended beyond child abuse to include systematic financial fraud that had been ongoing for years. The organization had been claiming to serve far more families than they actually assisted, inflating their numbers to qualify for larger grants and donations. Money that was supposed to provide services to needy families was being diverted to support the special programs and to pay for activities that had nothing to do with legitimate charitable work. Even more disturbing was evidence that children who had been abused through the Service League's programs were sometimes permanently removed from their families through fraudulent reports to Child Protective Services. The organization would claim that parents were unfit or abusive, providing false documentation to support their allegations and ensuring the children were placed in foster care situations controlled by Service League members. These children essentially disappeared into a system designed to make them permanently available for continued abuse. Michelle contacted federal law enforcement agencies when it became clear that local authorities were either unwilling or unable to investigate the Service League's activities. The FBI investigation that followed revealed that the organization had been operating a sophisticated child trafficking network for more than 15 years, using their legitimate charitable programs as cover for systematic abuse of vulnerable children. Hannah Brooks and 12 other Service League staff members and volunteers were arrested on charges including child trafficking, sexual abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. The investigation revealed that the organization had abused more than 60 children over 15 years, using their positions of trust and authority to exploit families who had nowhere else to turn for help. Michelle Thompson's courage in exposing the Service League's criminal activities saved countless children from future abuse, but the experience left her permanently changed by the discovery that trusted community organizations could be used as weapons against the most vulnerable members of society. The Service League building in Maplewood still stands empty, its windows boarded up as a reminder that even the most respected charitable organizations can hide unspeakable evil behind facades of compassion and community service. The town of Maplewood has struggled to recover from the revelation that one of its most celebrated organizations was actually a criminal enterprise that preyed on children and families who needed help the most. Many residents had volunteered with the Service League or donated money to support their programs, and the discovery that their good intentions had been manipulated to enable child abuse has left the community questioning whether they can trust any organization that claims to be helping others. The children and families who were victimized by the Service League continue to deal with the trauma of their experiences, knowing that people they trusted and depended on were actually using their vulnerability to cause them harm. The case has become a cautionary tale about the importance of oversight and accountability in charitable organizations and the need for communities to remain vigilant about protecting their most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their trust and desperation. James Patterson had always been fascinated by genealogy, spending his weekends tracing family trees and documenting the stories of ancestors who had lived and died long before his birth. When he inherited his grandmother's collection of family documents and photographs, he decided to research the Patterson family history in depth, hoping to create a comprehensive record that future generations could treasure. His investigation led him to Blackwater, North Carolina, a small town of 1,045 residents where his great-great-grandfather had settled in the 1890s after immigrating from Scotland. Blackwater sat in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, surrounded by dense forests and rolling farmland that had changed little since the town's founding. The community had been built around a lumber mill that processed timber from the surrounding mountains, and many of the original families still owned property that had been in their possession for more than a century. Main Street retained its 19th century character, with brick buildings housing businesses that served both local residents and tourists who visited the area for its scenic beauty and historical significance. The Blackwater Heritage Foundation operated out of a restored Victorian mansion that served as both a museum and research center for anyone interested in the town's history. The foundation had been established in 1964 by prominent local families who wanted to preserve documents, artifacts, and stories that documented the community's development from a frontier logging camp into a stable agricultural town. Margaret Caldwell, the Foundation's current director, was a distinguished woman in her 70s, whose own family had been among Blackwater's original settlers. James was welcomed warmly when he contacted the Foundation about researching his family history. Margaret Caldwell personally guided him through their extensive archives, which included birth and death records, property deeds, business ledgers, and thousands of photographs that chronicled life in Blackwater from its earliest days. The Foundation maintained detailed genealogical records for most of the families who had lived in the area, creating a comprehensive database that researchers could use to trace connections between different branches of their family trees. The Patterson family records were particularly extensive, documenting 5 generations of births, marriages, deaths, and property transactions that painted a detailed picture of how James's ancestors had lived and worked in the Blackwater area. His great-great-grandfather had arrived with very little money, but had gradually accumulated land and built a successful farming operation that had supported his descendants for decades. The family had been active in community affairs, serving on church boards, school committees, and various civic organizations that had shaped the town's development. James was impressed by the Foundation's meticulous record-keeping and their obvious dedication to preserving local history. Margaret Caldwell seemed to know intimate details about every family that had ever lived in Blackwater, and her stories brought the dry facts in the archives to life with anecdotes about personalities, relationships, and events that had shaped the community's character. She encouraged James to spend as much time as needed going through the records, offering to help him understand the context behind the documents he was discovering. During his research, James began to notice patterns in the Foundation's records that seemed unusual for a typical small town. Certain families appeared to have unusually detailed documentation, with records that tracked not just basic vital statistics, but also personality traits, talents, health conditions, and other characteristics that seemed to go beyond normal genealogical research. Some files included photographs and notes that documented multiple generations of the same families, creating profiles that resembled breeding records more than family histories. Even more unusual was the Foundation's practice of maintaining what they called connection maps that traced relationships between different families going back several generations. These elaborate charts showed not just marriages and direct family relationships, but also more distant connections, including friendships, business partnerships, and other associations that had linked various families over time. The maps were incredibly detailed, suggesting that the Foundation had invested enormous effort in tracking even minor connections between community members. James's curiosity was piqued when he discovered that his own family was featured prominently in these connection maps, with detailed notations about Patterson family members going back to his great-great-grandfather's arrival in Blackwater. The maps showed connections to dozens of other families in the area, creating a web of relationships that seemed to encompass virtually everyone who had ever lived in the town. Some of the notations included references to characteristics and abilities that had been passed down through different family lines, as if the Foundation was tracking genetic traits across multiple generations. When James asked Margaret Caldwell about these unusual records, she explained that the Foundation took a comprehensive approach to documenting local history. Understanding the connections between families was essential for preserving the full story of how the community had developed, and tracking characteristics across generations helped explain why certain families had been particularly successful or influential in the town's affairs. The Foundation's mission was to ensure that future researchers would have access to complete information about their ancestors and their place in the community's history. James found this explanation plausible until he began to notice references in the Foundation's records to families who had apparently been encouraged or required to form marriages based on recommendations from community leaders. The records contained correspondence between prominent families discussing potential marriages between their children, with detailed analysis of how such unions would benefit the community's genetic heritage. Some letters were quite explicit about the goal of ensuring that desirable traits were passed down to future generations, while preventing marriages that might introduce unwanted characteristics. The pattern became even more disturbing when James discovered records showing that families who refused to follow the Foundation's marriage recommendations sometimes faced social and economic pressure that forced them to leave Blackwater entirely. Property records showed that non-compliant families had often sold their land at below-market prices to Foundation board members or their allies, suggesting that economic coercion had been used to enforce compliance with the community's breeding program. James realized that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation wasn't simply preserving local history, but had been operating a systematic program to control which families remained in the community and who they were allowed to marry. The Foundation's extensive genealogical records were actually breeding charts designed to maintain genetic lines that the organization's leadership considered desirable, while eliminating families whose characteristics were deemed problematic or inferior. His investigation revealed that this program had been operating for more than 60 years, with Foundation leaders serving as unofficial matchmakers who arranged marriages between young people whose family lines were considered genetically compatible. Children who refused to marry according to the Foundation's recommendations were often ostracized from the community, denied employment opportunities, and pressured to relocate to areas where their genetic heritage wouldn't contaminate the carefully maintained bloodlines of Blackwater's founding families. Even more horrifying was James's discovery that the Foundation had been involved in systematic elimination of individuals whose genetic makeup was considered undesirable. The records contained documentation of suspicious deaths, unexplained disappearances, and forced institutionalizations that had removed dozens of people from the community over the decades. Individuals with physical disabilities, mental illness, or other conditions that the Foundation considered genetic defects had been systematically eliminated to prevent them from reproducing and passing their characteristics to future generations. The Foundation's activities extended beyond controlling marriages to include monitoring the health and development of all children born in the community. The organization maintained detailed records of every child's physical and mental characteristics, identifying those who showed signs of undesirable traits that needed to be addressed before they reached reproductive age. Children who were deemed genetically inferior were often removed from their families through fabricated reports to social services, then placed in institutions where they couldn't reproduce. James's research revealed that his own family had been participants in this breeding program for generations, with Patterson marriages carefully arranged to enhance desired genetic traits while avoiding combinations that might produce unwanted characteristics. His grandparents, his parents, and even his own birth had been planned and approved by Foundation leaders who had analyzed the genetic heritage of both family lines to ensure that the union would produce offspring with the desired physical and mental attributes. The realization that his entire family history had been manipulated by a secret breeding program was devastating enough. But James's investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth about the Foundation's ultimate goals. The organization wasn't simply trying to improve the genetic makeup of Blackwater's population, but was part of a larger network that was conducting genetic experiments designed to create superior human beings for use by powerful individuals and organizations outside. The community, the Foundation's carefully maintained bloodlines, were actually breeding stock for a human trafficking operation that provided genetically superior individuals to wealthy clients who wanted children with specific physical and mental characteristics. Young people who had been bred according to the Foundation's specifications were systematically removed from Blackwater through fake opportunities, arranged marriages to outsiders, or outright kidnapping, then delivered to buyers who had paid enormous sums for access to genetically engineered human beings. James discovered records showing that dozens of Blackwater residents had been sold over the decades, their disappearances explained as voluntary relocations or educational opportunities that had taken them to other parts of the country. In reality, these individuals had been delivered to buyers who wanted servants, surrogate mothers, organ donors, or subjects for medical experimentation, with their genetic heritage carefully documented to ensure that purchasers received exactly what they had ordered. The Foundation's breeding program had created multiple generations of individuals who had been specifically designed to meet the demands of various markets for genetically superior human beings. Some family lines had been bred for physical strength and endurance, others for intelligence and creativity, and still others for specific physical characteristics that were valued by particular buyers. The entire community of Blackwater had essentially become a human breeding farm, operated under the cover of historical preservation and genealogical research. When James attempted to expose the Foundation's activities, he discovered that Clark Diana Foster was actually Margaret Caldwell's daughter and a key participant in the breeding program's administrative operations. Foster had been responsible for maintaining the official records that concealed the Foundation's criminal activities, creating false documentation that supported the cover stories used to explain disappearances and forced relocations. James's investigation was interrupted when he was approached by Foundation security personnel who had been monitoring his research activities. The Foundation had discovered that he was asking too many questions and accessing records that revealed the true nature of their operations. James was informed that he would need to become a permanent resident of Blackwater, where his continued research activities could be properly supervised, and his genetic heritage could contribute to the community's breeding program. The confrontation with Foundation personnel convinced James that he was in immediate danger and needed to escape from Blackwater before he became another victim of their human trafficking operation. He managed to copy the most damaging records and flee the town under cover of darkness, eventually reaching federal law enforcement agencies that were already investigating reports of missing persons and human trafficking activities in rural North Carolina. The FBI investigation that followed revealed that the Blackwater Heritage Foundation had been operating one of the most sophisticated human breeding and trafficking networks ever discovered in the United States. Margaret Caldwell, Diana Foster, and 19 of the Foundation members were arrested on charges including human trafficking, kidnapping, conspiracy, and murder. The investigation revealed that the organization had been responsible for the disappearance of more than 130 people over 50 years, using their genealogical research activities as cover for systematic breeding and sale of human beings. James Patterson never returned to Blackwater after testifying at the trials that eventually convicted the Foundation leadership. His genealogical research had revealed that his family's entire history had been fabricated and manipulated by criminals who had used genetic engineering to create human beings for sale to the highest bidders. The discovery that even his own existence had been planned and controlled by traffickers left him questioning everything he had believed about his identity and heritage. The town of Blackwater continues to exist, but most of the original families have dispersed to other areas where their genetic heritage isn't a matter of public record. The Heritage Foundation building now stands empty, its archives seized as evidence in ongoing investigations into the network of human trafficking operations that had used small American towns as breeding facilities for more than half a century.